Bishop George Berkeley is one of those philosophers who came to a final conclusion that many of us cannot accept, but who has become influential and admired for the reasoning that led to his conclusion. In Berkeley's case, the conclusion is his denial of the existence of matter, of objects existing outside of our minds. Yet his work is well worth the effort, even if you have a hard time taking that seriously. It shows that philosophy is an activity whose real excitement is in the debate. In general, Berkeley will largely assume a position about the origin of our knowledge within a theory known as empiricism. The classical empiricists, John Locke, Berkeley, and David Hume, regarded our knowledge of the world as coming from sense experience. According to Locke, instead of there being any innate ideas, we have nothing in the mind that is not first in the senses. Even ideas that seem too general, or ideas about something we do not see, will have their origin in sense experience, however indirectly. We may, for instance, know things about motion in general that apply to all moving things without seeing all things. But an idea such as motion is related to sense experience of seeing things move, and has its origin in it by being abstracted from what sense experiences we have. And so the process of abstraction, or formulating general ideas, becomes important. This process will become especially important here because Berkeley will argue that the notion of an object outside of the mind is an abstraction. In considering what we will mean by a universal or general term, such as chair, man, triangle, we may formulate an idea of what the things that we call by these names all have in common. An idea of man gets generated when we look at Peter, James, and John in terms of what qualities they have in common and resembling each other, leaving out what is peculiar to each and retaining what is common to all. Likewise with motion, we may abstract an idea of motion by leaving out all particular figures and their velocities and directions, creating an idea of motion that applies to all walking, flying, or creeping. These words then get applied to particular things common to all members of the class, without having to perceive all of them. However, each particular may be different in terms of any attribute we may consider. A man may be of a certain skin tone or stature, or a triangle may be of a certain type, equilateral, isosceles, right angle. Motion in general will have velocity and direction, but any particular thing in motion we can talk about will have its own determinate velocity and direction. When it comes to qualities or modes, we do not assume that these exist separate and apart from the particular things that possess them. We can have no idea of color without extension, and no idea of motion without both color and extension. But leaving out the particular color, direction, and velocity and height, I can then get an idea of color, motion, and stature. Once we have ideas of these qualities or modes, we can then apply them to a new particular man or thing in motion that we may consider or imagine. Likewise, once I have ideas of chair and man, I can examine the thing on which I sit, compare it to those ideas, and determine that it is a chair rather than a man. So far, Berkeley is following his predecessors, but here he wishes to point to a problem in the imagination regarding these universal ideas. He admits he can imagine many things, such as a man with two heads, or the upper parts of a man joined to the body of a horse. Where we can imagine parts that can be separated from others and can exist independently, we can abstract them like this. However, it is not so easy a process when the thing must possess a quality or mode that cannot exist separate or apart from the thing that possesses it. I can imagine an eye separate from the body, but it must have some color, which cannot exist separate and apart from some colored thing. Whenever I imagine a man or a thing in motion, I must always in my mind attribute to it or imagine it having a determinate quality or mode. The man I imagine in my mind as representative of man in general must have a determined stature, and he may be white or tawny. I cannot imagine him having height as such, but not any particular height, and must effectively assign one to him. A body I imagine to be in motion gets assigned by my imagination a determinate velocity and direction, rather than velocity as such that has no quantity or direction, that is this one or that one. I therefore cannot imagine the abstract general idea being described as motion, distinct from the body moving. And Berkeley concludes in section 10 of the introduction. To be plain, I own myself able to abstract in one sense, as when I consider some particular parts or qualities separated from others, with which, though they are united in some object, yet it is possible they may really exist without them. But I deny that I can abstract from one another or conceive separately those qualities which it is impossible should exist so separated, or that I can frame a general notion by abstracting from particulars in the manner aforesaid. So now what Berkeley has pointed out is that abstract ideas have a one-directionality to them. Whether this justifies his denial that he can, as he says, frame a general notion is debatable, but it seems he is right about the one-directionality problem at least. We can generalize from chairs we perceive, those properties they all have in common, but we cannot form a mental image of a chair that exhibits just chairness, without particular qualities of a set size, or which does not resemble an office, living room, or dining room chair, but is just chair as such. It is because a quality like size cannot exist on its own separated from something that always has a size. This is partly the kind of thinking that leads Plato to conclude that our concepts must exist as forms in a supersensible world, because no particular can otherwise be found that exhibits just the essential characteristics alone, with nothing peculiar to itself. But Berkeley is inheriting a nominalist tradition that rejects this Platonic realism and instead says that universals are merely convenient names, that we don't need them to be anything else, and that there is no good reason to suppose they exist outside of the mind or that any entity corresponds to them. And so, in order to clarify and expand his criticism of the doctrine of abstract ideas, Berkeley now turns to a doctrine of abstraction, serving the functions of communicating and expanding our knowledge, as exhibited in Locke's 1690 essay concerning human understanding. At this point, before Berkeley and I start talking about abstract general ideas, ideas that are just general, and particular ideas, I will go into the meaning of this term, idea. In everyday usage, it can mean a number of things, such as a proposal for a belief or a suggested activity. Berkeley will not use the term in those senses. Up to this point, he has used the term idea as meaning a general concept, a universal. He will also use it in the sense regarding a particular thing as a perception of it, where the object as perceived is my idea or representation of it. So, when I perceive a chair, its visual image in my mind is my idea of it, while my conception of what constitutes chairness is a general idea. For Locke, one of the differences between men and beasts is that we are capable of forming general ideas, with our use of words as signs of general ideas. Other animals may be capable of reason to some degree, but about particular things, and cannot enlarge that faculty through abstraction. In a world in which everything is particular, Locke says, words become general by being made the signs of general ideas. Berkeley, however, wants to distinguish between abstract general ideas and ideas that are just general. For Berkeley, a word becomes a sign not of an abstract idea, but of several particular ideas, such that my general idea of chair is not really of chairness, but of the chairs. He wishes to dispute this doctrine of abstract ideas, that we have abstract general ideas to which words refer as signs, rather than the signs being of several particular ideas denoted by the universal term. So what's the difference? He has a difference in mind about how we think about a universal proposition. If we say the change of motion is proportional to the impressed force, we understand this to be a statement about motion in general. But it does not follow that it suggests an idea of motion without a body moved. The proposition asserts only that what is stated about motion is to be true of any particular motion of any velocity or direction I may consider. In demonstrating a universal proposition, Berkeley has us imagine that a geometrician wants to demonstrate to us the method of cutting a line into two equal parts, and draws a black line 1 inch long. This represents all lines, so that what is demonstrated is universally true. And so he says in section 12 of the introduction, he draws, for instance, a black line of 1 inch in length. This, which in itself is a particular line, is nevertheless, with regard to its signification, general, since, as it is there used, it represents all particular lines whatsoever, so that what is demonstrated of it is demonstrated of all lines, or in other words, of a line in general. And as that particular line becomes general by being made a sign, so the name line, which taken absolutely is particular, by being a sign is made general. And as the former owes its generality not to its being the sign of an abstract or general line, but of all particular right lines that may possibly exist. This is because Berkeley has words for general ideas, represent or signify particular things that can be objects of sense experience, or at least of imagination, such as a unicorn, that are themselves particular but become rendered universal. The word does not represent or signify its meaning or essence, because the thing we imagine as representing the essence will have to be itself a particular. In this way, it makes sense to demand that the process of abstraction, or generalizing, be fit to produce a mental image, where a particular in vision can serve as a sign of all things that have the same name. In framing an idea of a triangle in my imagination, it need not be, just as it cannot be, a universal triangle that is neither equilateral nor scalanon nor something else. What counts for Berkeley, he says, is only that the particular triangle I consider, he says, whether of this or that sort it matters not, doth equally stand for and represent all rectilinear triangles whatsoever, and is in that sense universal. If anyone should object that it prevents proper demonstration, Berkeley's reply is that all it is required is that the triangle under consideration be understood as representing all triangles, for it then to be shown, for example, that the sum of the angles will be equal to 2 right angles. And a triangle that is not of any type or is an abstract triangle as such is just not needed. By the foregoing, Berkeley intended to dispute that abstract ideas are needed for the enlargement of knowledge. I now turn to how Berkeley disputes the communication part of Locke's theory that abstract ideas are needed in communication. Berkeley's argument in its simplest form is to claim that communication happens without learning abstraction. Abstraction involves toil of the mind to emancipate our thought from particular objects and raise them to something sublime. This would not seem to be required for communication that seems easy and familiar to all men. This abstraction for communication would then, under this scenario, be a business of childhood, to form the notions we need to communicate as adults, who are not conscious of the mental effort involved as adults. If abstraction were required for communication, it would require that children resolve numberless inconsistencies to frame abstract ideas and annex them to every name they use before they can talk about their sugar plums, rattles, and other trinkets. As for the origin of the prevailing notion of abstraction, it must be language, as is effectively confessed by its adherents. The words are used for naming, and there could be no such thing as speech standing for signs without thoughts of abstraction, of the proper or improper kind. As for how words contribute to this error, Berkeley points to the theory or assumption that every name has, or ought to have, only one precise and settled signification. This leads people to think there is a distinctive idea constituting a one true signification of a particular thing that is attached to a name. But just as Berkeley regarded that for abstract general ideas to be valid, they would have to be able to produce a mental image, he now draws a distinction between a definition and an idea. We may define a triangle as a plane surface comprehended by 3 right lines, by which it is limited to denote one certain idea and no other. No description is included in the definition that states large or small, black or white, equal or unequal, among the many varieties of triangle. We can keep a name fixed to a definition, but it is another matter to make it stand everywhere for the true idea. So we are now in a better position to give an account of how words come to produce a doctrine of abstract ideas. It is commonly held that language has its purpose in communicating ideas, and that every significant name stands for an idea. Some names do seem to stand for abstract notions rather than particular things. It is not necessary that every name excite in the understanding the idea for which it stands. Names can function in discourse in a way similar to letters used as variables in algebra, where we may proceed without specifying or even knowing the quantity represented by the letter. And it is language itself, not a need to communicate ideas or expand knowledge, that leads to this doctrine of abstract ideas. And so the name triangle should be understood as something referring to all triangles, rather than some kind of perfect triangle that we cannot actually picture in our heads. In other words, when we have names that refer to a universal thing that exhibits the commonality, rather than a group of things having something in common, we have an abstract notion that does not need to signify a general abstract idea. And this concludes the introduction to the principles of human knowledge, and we will proceed to Berkeley's theory of the doctrine of abstract ideas implying a false metaphysical doctrine. The objects of our knowledge are the ideas of what we have through the impressions of the senses, that we can also replicate in memory and imagination. When several of these products of sensations, an odor, a taste, a color, are observed to accompany each other, they are marked with a name and regarded as a thing. Some sensations will, when composed together, allow us, for instance, to observe color patterns, smell, and tactile sensations as an apple, and the taste can confirm it. There is also something that knows and perceives these objects of knowledge. It is mind, spirit, soul, or myself that can also will, imagine, or remember about it. This mind is not itself an idea, is entirely distinct from ideas, and is the wherein of the existence of the ideas. Everyone can easily agree that thought, imagination, and ideas do not exist without the mind or outside of it. Those combinations of sense impressions, however they may be blended, are such that whatever they compose also does not exist except in the mind. Here is where Berkeley will start going against the conventional wisdom that believes in extended things outside the mind. For him, these combinations of sense impressions and their regularities is something that implies and effectively constitutes the existence or objective reality of a thing. I buy an apple from the store, put it in the fridge, find it in the fridge later, and take it out. I can add to these sensations by eating it. Anyone else in the room can see me eat the apple and hear the crunch when I bite into it. A thing is ultimately these sense impressions that accompany each other in a collection. All this time it is, according to Berkeley, being perceived by me or by another spirit. The divine author of our being can here serve as the perceiver of the apple while it sat in the closed fridge, and thus guarantee its continuing existence, because God perceives all things everywhere. Whatever you might be tempted to think of that, he will later deal with the issue of whether matter ever could be the cause of our sense impressions. The point for now is that the reliable stream of ideas is ultimately what the objective reality of the thing means. He says its esse est percipii. Its being is being perceived. In other words, its reality consists in its being the content of perceptions, and no other existence of it is real or even necessary. In section 6 of the Principles, he states his position on what there is, his taxonomy of being. Some truths there are so near and obvious to the mind that a man need only open his eyes to see them. Such I take this one to be, namely, that all the choir of heaven and furniture of the earth, in a word, all those bodies which compose the mighty frame of the world, have not any subsistence without a mind, that their being is to be perceived or known, that consequently, so long as they are not actually perceived by me, or do not exist in my mind, or that of any other created spirit, they must either have no existence at all or else subsist in the mind of some eternal spirit. Berkeley calls it a strange doctrine that houses, mountains, and rivers, in a word, sensible objects, have an existence distinct from their being perceived. Because for him the reliable stream of sensations make up the objective reality of the object, it strikes him as a contradiction. It is saying that the content of perception exists outside of perception, and he likens it to dividing a thing from itself. What is an object except the things we perceive by sense that are observed to accompany each other in a collection? What we end up perceiving is our own ideas, and it is repugnant to suggest that objects exist unperceived. Yet people do believe in objects external to the mind, and Berkeley says that this tenet will be found at bottom to depend upon the doctrine of abstract ideas. It is perhaps the grandest of all abstractions to imagine an object existing independent of the mind. Berkeley concedes that we do have a limited power to abstract regarding objects. He can imagine the trunk of a human body without the limbs, or the smell of a rose without the rose. This is abstraction of what may possibly exist, or be perceived asunder. But the power cannot transcend the possibility of perception. Once again, he dips back into the mental image requirement. He cannot conceive in thought a sensible thing separate from sensations or perceptions of it. In other words, we do not have experience of an object outside of experience. Berkeley tells us that this tenet of the object outside the mind will be developed to regard my idea of the object as a mental copy or representation of an external object that then gets taken to be the cause of my sense impressions of it. If this view of the cause of sensations is true, then the object must exist outside the mind, even if within the mind it is only an abstraction. Here we have a distinction between the reality and the appearance of the object. Although at this point Berkeley might prefer to say it's between reality and bad abstraction. However, he does admit that the world that we have in our sense experience would be the same if God, or if inert matter, caused our sense impressions of it. Under the theories of dualism and materialism that assert objects to exist outside of our minds, we can still draw a distinction between the object outside of our minds as not being the same thing as our mental image of it. Stand on a railroad track, look ahead, and you will see in the distance the rails meeting each other. The fact that the train does not derail proves that the track and our vision of it must be separate entities if both exist. And for Berkeley, the true and only real object is the content of our perception. This theory, as opposed to dualism and materialism, is what in metaphysics is known as idealism. It is that mind exists, not matter. Berkeley prefers to call it his immaterialism. His three main arguments why this should be accepted as valid are that matter is self-contradictory abstraction, that our experiences of primary qualities show us no reality that secondary qualities do not possess, and that inert matter is not the cause of perception. I have gone through abstraction and will now move on to the distinction about qualities. I want to start that by considering a famous, supposedly unanswerable question that in fact does have an answer. If a tree falls in the forest and there is no animal with ears within hearing range, does it make a sound? The supposed impossibility of answering this is based on a merely verbal disagreement between the possible alternatives. A tree falling to the ground will produce sound waves that get translated into noise within the animal's perception by its ears. So if by making a sound we mean producing a noise in the perception of the animal, then the tree falling does not make a sound. If by making a sound we mean producing a wave energy that is associated with the sound once it enters ears, then the tree falling produces a sound. My point is that sound ends up not being something inherent in the thing or event, but is produced by an interaction with the sense organs. Like colors, smell, tactile sensations, and taste, sound is a secondary or sensible quality that is not considered to be inherent in the object. The primary or original qualities that have been thought to belong to atoms and the objects they compose are extension, figure, motion or rest, number, and solidity or impenetrability. This distinction was accepted by Locke and by scientists of Berkeley's day. It was held that the primary qualities inhere in the objects. Berkeley starts by pointing out that people who believe that primary or original qualities exist outside of the mind in unthinking substances concede that secondary qualities exist only in the mind. But the problem here is that we cannot separate the two groups of qualities in our idea of the object and perceive or imagine just the primary quality. So he says, now if it be certain that these original qualities are inseparably united with the other sensible qualities, and not even in thought capable of being abstracted from them, it plainly follows that they exist only in the mind. He challenges the reader to conceive, by any abstraction of thought, the extension or motion of a body without the other sensible qualities. He says he cannot form an idea of the extended or moving object without at least assigning a color to it, which is acknowledged to only exist in the mind, and thus extension, motion, and figure do not exist in an external object. In a similar way, relative judgments of great and small, swift or slow, depend upon perspective or change of position of the sense organ. They clearly can exist nowhere but in the mind. An extension in itself is neither great nor small, and a motion in itself is neither swift nor slow. Number is also shown to be relative in the example that the same unchanging length of a yardstick can be 1, 3, or 36, depending on whether the unit selected is yards, feet, or inches. One unit is no more real than the others. And as for the idea of a unity, well, that's another abstract idea. Berkeley's argument, in the way that he states it, is about how I cannot have a mental image of a primary quality, such as extension or figure, without at least one secondary quality, such as color. I can also confirm the primary quality of solidity by means of tactile sensations that also only exist in the mind. There is another way of understanding this that Berkeley does not explicitly argue, but it is consistent with what he says. Let's go back to what Berkeley says about a thing constituting qualities being consistently found to accompany each other, such as the color, smell, and taste of an apple. Another way of arguing is to say that we can only discern the figure and extension of a thing by means of secondary qualities. This is how we come to see a thing as separate from other things and not have the entire perceptual field presented to us as one big blob. All of our ideas of a thing's figure and extension are discerned by color patterns. Solidity can be discerned by tactile sensations. Either way, it is the secondary qualities that allow for the thing to be given in experience. If the secondary qualities do not exist except in the mind, then neither do the primary qualities. What we mean by a material object or substance is something that possesses the qualities of extension and figure. Therefore, a material object or substance can only exist as the content of a perception. At this point, Berkeley may have some readers who still believe that objects exist outside of our minds, possibly for two reasons. One reason would be that what we sense is not a product of our will and must therefore have a cause outside of ourselves. Another reason is that the things appearing in our sensations seem to follow laws of nature. These issues will be dealt with, but at this point, Berkeley asks, if it were true that objects exist outside of our minds, how could we ever know it? There are only two ways for us to know anything, by sense experience or by reason. Obviously, sense experience cannot tell us that something exists outside of our sense experience. It may be an inference from sense experience, but it is only by reason that it could be known if true. Materialists themselves admit this, and further do not pretend that there is a necessary connection between bodies outside the mind and our ideas. For what happens in dreams and frenzies shows that we may be affected with the same sensations with or without a body outside the mind resembling them. And so Berkeley states that hence it is evident this supposition of external bodies is not necessary for the producing of our ideas. Yet even if we concede that it would be easier to conceive and explain the manner of the production of our ideas by supposing external bodies in their likeness, exciting their ideas in our minds, we are still nowhere near explaining how that is done. Materialists are themselves unable to comprehend in what manner body can act upon spirit, and how it can imprint an idea on the mind. If the production of our ideas remains equally inexplicable with or without matter, then the production of our ideas is no reason why we should suppose matter or corporeal substances. One clue we have to resolve the issue that Berkeley points to is that all ideas, sensations, and things we perceive are inactive or inert, having no power or agency in them. This means that an idea or object of sense cannot produce or alter another. The very being of an idea implies its inertness. Therefore, extension, figure, and motion cannot be the cause of our sensations. Yet it is still true that we perceive a continual succession of ideas that must have some cause that produces and changes our ideas. If the cause cannot be a quality, idea, or combination of ideas, then the cause must be a substance. Berkeley will argue that it must be a spiritual rather than a corporeal substance. The advantage of spirit here is that it has faculties of understanding and will. It is not passive or inert, and also is not perceived as any image or likeness. It is an active principle, and only its effects can be perceived. If we try, we can excite ideas in our own minds at pleasure and change them in ways we see fit. The making of ideas is for active minds, and Berkeley says that when we talk of unthinking agents, or of exciting ideas exclusive of volition, we only amuse ourselves with words. But what about those sensations and ideas we have that are clearly involuntary? Berkeley admits that it is not in his power to choose what will present itself to him when he opens his eyes. Therefore, it is some other will or spirit that produces them. The nature of this involuntariness itself makes an argument for our ideas being caused by another spirit. And so Berkeley tells us in section 30, the ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of the imagination. They have likewise a steadiness, order, and coherence, and are not excited at random, as those which are the effects of human wills often are, but in a regular train or series, the admirable connection whereof sufficiently testifies the wisdom and benevolence of its author, with a capital A. Berkeley not only makes God the cause of this sensation or that idea, but also the composer of the laws of nature. He further argues that if this were not actually true, our lives would be filled with uncertainty and confusion. According to him, we know how to survive by observing settled laws of nature and learning that food nourishes, sleep refreshes, and fire warms us. It is not by discovering any necessary connection between ideas. This uniform working displays the goodness and wisdom of God, whose will constitutes the laws of nature. When we do not recognize this, our thoughts go wandering in search of second causes. When we find some ideas invariably followed by other ideas, knowing that it is not from our will that it happens this way, we attribute power and agency to the ideas themselves and make one the cause of the other. In this way, Berkeley also seeks to prevent a skepticism taking hold that he believes materialism will produce and lead to impiety. Having the world be explained by operations of inert matter deprives us of the notion that we do see the glory of God in an immediate way whenever we open our eyes and look at anything. For him, God being the source of our ideas of sense, gives us a proof as direct as we could get of God's existence, and he does assert that this is proof of God's existence. So now going into possibly valid criticisms, I will first point out that the way that Berkeley deals with the question of why that apple was still in the fridge while no human was perceiving it is to make it because God was perceiving it there. Yet the apple being there when I go back to the fridge to get it is part of what Berkeley calls the consistency of perception within the laws of nature that he says proves God's existence. This is circular reasoning, or begging the question on his part. According to him, the apple was still in the fridge because God exists, and God exists because the apple was still in the fridge. Even if we accept everything Berkeley says about the doctrine of abstraction, we are left to wonder why other finite minds, and God, are not even more grandiose abstractions than material substance. As for other finite minds, he does admit in section 145 that he cannot know the existence of other minds except through their operations exciting ideas within him. Yet it is ideas of other people's bodies, not their spirits, that he takes as signs of their existence. It is because he says in section 146, these sensations are not produced by his will, and thus are produced by another spirit. God is still more evidently perceived than the existence of men, but Berkeley does not really question the existence of other men. He tacitly assumes it to be God's intention, and thus part of nature. I think in reality, Berkeley just did not want to bring the existence of other persons into question, because he would have thought it stupid or insane. I imagine he was also too polite to consider the question of how new finite minds are produced by their parents without the external reality of their bodies. Also, if the world is what God directly inserts into our minds, it raises the question of whether any two minds even have the same world. I guess God would just be what we call nice and take care of those issues. Yet Berkeley's system opens the door to other possibilities. A standard approach to critiquing Berkeley is to say that he draws too strong a conclusion from his premises. It can be argued that at best, what he has proven is only that the existence of matter cannot be proven. Alternatively, even if the external object must exist, he has proven that we could know nothing about it. Ironically, this is where Berkeley has been influential in a way he would not have wished. Either way, arguments can also be made that belief in matter is still rational in some sense, even in the absence of proof. Nevertheless, Berkeley has drawn praise particularly from William James in his pragmatism, because at the end of the day, Berkeley advocates for philosophy to concentrate on explaining the world as it is in our sense experience, and not some different world. I also recommend his work not just for historical importance, but also for the challenge he presents to a belief that most of us just assume to be true. So if you liked it, check out my other videos, send links to your friends, and thanks for watching.